Let's talk about finding a commercial property for a recording studio in 2024/2025. I'm based in the UK, so obviously my experience is going to be based upon the UK property market, but hopefully wherever you are, this will be useful to you and you'll find some stuff that you can take away from this video. Let's get right into it. I think it's always been difficult finding a suitable commercial premises for a recording studio. So if you look at other types of businesses, retail, for example, you can find loads of spaces out there that are kitted out already, built with that purpose in mind, or they have been retrofitted with that purpose in mind. So there are loads of buildings out there that are great for a shop, a retail type business, and you don't have to do as much structural work to make it suitable for your business. Whereas for a recording studio, unless you're lucky enough to find somewhere that has previously been a studio for rent or to purchase, and you can take that on, and its existing infrastructure kind of works for you and for your needs. For most people, you're going to be looking at building something from the ground up. You're going to be looking at industrial type spaces, both from the perspective of being able to build something suitable inside, but also because of location. Location-wise, industrial areas tend to be away from residential properties, so you're not going to necessarily disturb other people, especially if you're not able to do any kind of soundproofing, and you're going to be less disturbed by noise coming in, again, especially if you can't do any kind of soundproofing. So in that sense, industrial areas are great for recording studios. And then in terms of finding somewhere that's more of a shell of a space, and then you can build it out inside to suit your needs, that's an obvious benefit to this type of space. But at the same time, there's a real downside to that. And the downside really is that you've got all that cost of building a space, especially if you're doing soundproofing, you're building room within a room type structures for your live room and control room, and then any other rooms that you might have inside your studio space. That quickly becomes very costly. You're talking like tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds in material costs. So that's a huge startup cost that many of us aren't going to be able to afford, or even if we can afford it, justify. If you think about that level of investment as well, if you're investing that into a rental space, then you're spending all this money on structural work on someone else's building. You can't then take that with you when you then move, or say if the landlord decides to sell up the property and you get booted out, there's nothing you can do and you've lost that investment that you've made. The counter argument to that is that, say if you find somewhere on a minimum term lease, you get a 10-year lease or something like that, and the startup costs you have with doing all the structural work, based on the projections you make, you know that you can see X amount of return and you can make X amount of profit, where it's going to justify that cost that you spent initially. You're going to recoup that investment. So it really doesn't matter in that sense if you then move out of that building and you have to leave all that material work that you did behind. You've made that money back on your investment, so it was a solid investment. But that is the downside to renting. So buying a property is certainly an option, but in today's market, it isn't necessarily for most of us, I think. Certainly isn't for me. In the UK, you're looking at a minimum 20% deposit for a commercial mortgage, as opposed to your 5 or 10% mortgages that you can get for a residential property. So you're looking at double the level of deposit. And on top of that, commercial properties are really about twice as expensive to buy as a residential property. So it's a huge amount of investment, and you're looking at a very long-term mortgage as well. So again, you'd have to be able to justify that and make that work with the mortgage payments, with the return that you see from the business. If you can justify that, then it's definitely an option. But I think for many of us, it isn't. So we talked a bit about industrial type spaces. Those kind of areas are ideal for a recording studio space, but you might look within your city centre as well. If you're surrounded by other active businesses and you're away from residential properties in the city centre near a bunch of bars or places that aren't really going to be bothered by noise because they're making noise themselves. The important thing is that wherever you're looking, you do your homework and you kind of scope those things out first. Think about your neighbours, who you might have around you and what problems that might bring with it. If you can deal with those problems, because if you can do soundproofing, then any of those things is going to be less of an issue and it doesn't matter quite as much where you are. You also have to think about location in terms of your client base. I do believe that if you build a nice enough studio, people will come. If you have a nice enough studio and you have enough of a USP, so you can sell yourself as an engineer or engineer producer, and people want to come to you to record. Doesn't matter so much where you are, people will come to you, particularly if, on the flip side, building a studio out in the countryside somewhere really picturesque where you could maybe build a live-in studio where people can come and stay with you for a week or a weekend to record. A lot of people love that, because that means they can be fully focused on making music. They can be removed from their day-to-day life stresses and be away somewhere nice and picturesque and inspiring that, makes them want to record and create great music. So that could be a USP in itself. So you don't necessarily have to kind of be where people are. You don't have to be in the city. That is something to consider. If you feel like people wouldn't travel to come to you, maybe having your studio based in the city is a better option for you, because getting people through the door off the bat, if you're building a reputation still, networking with people, that's a better location to be. You're amongst the creative scene of your particular city. Think about your client base and location, where you are, businesses that might be around you or residential properties, and who you may be disturbing and who might disturb you, and whether or not you can deal with that with things like soundproofing. When I was finding my studio, especially coming from the previous studio, we were in a shared business space, and this is another option. So the space we had is owned by a company that they own several factory type buildings that they've fitted out, turned into a bunch of individual units inside, and then they rent those out. Quite a lot of their spaces, primarily they're based around creative type businesses. So you get a lot of bands renting spaces for a rehearsal room, other studios, DJ studios, art studios, dance studios, lots of creative type businesses. We were in one of these type of buildings, and that can be a great option in many ways. You're amongst like-minded people, so it can be great for networking. You're going to have other people, especially bands, if they're going to rehearsal spaces there and then they see your cool studio, that can potentially be a good in with your local music scene. On the flip side, a lot of these old factory buildings, they're usually not soundproofed, which was the case where we were. These old factory buildings usually have pretty poor insulation, and so sound travels, particularly between floors, and we were sandwiched in between two floors. Sound travels a lot. We had a dance studio above us where there were tap dancing lessons that would happen several times a week, and it sounded like there was a stampede happening above us whenever that was going on. So that was pretty annoying. We had a band rehearsal unit one side of us where they thankfully weren't active too much, but a few evenings a week they would be rehearsing and all that noise would travel through our main live room. The space we moved into actually had already been kitted out. It was one big open space originally, but somebody, actually a friend of mine, had previously been there and built it out as a studio and built a live room, which was a room within a room type structure and was fairly soundproofed, but even then noise came through. So that's the one downside of being in a shared space like that. And that's where maybe you should scope it out a bit beforehand, chat to the landlord or building owner and try and find out, what businesses are around you, the particular unit that you're looking at. Maybe speak to some of those businesses, just, have a nice friendly chat with them, see when they're active and, how much noise they might make and whether you might be a disturbance to them as well. One thing that I've done in the past when I was coming from that studio, looking for a new space before I found the space that I'm at now, I viewed some places where I was worried about surrounding noise disturbances. So I asked if I could bring along a portable audio recorder and leave it there for a day recording and then come pick it up, the next day or whatever. Not everywhere's going to be okay with you doing that, obviously, but in some cases they were. And then that meant that I could listen back to the recording, get an idea of what sort of noise might be coming in, and then whether I'd be able to do any kind of structural work to compensate for that, and if I could even afford that. Coming from the previous studio where I had all the sort of assets, the business assets, all the recording equipment, acoustic treatment and all of that stuff, but I didn't have any capital behind me. Really, all I had was some money saved up for a rental deposit and then a float on rental money to see me through like 6 months or so, which is really important. You should definitely think about having some float money to see you through, I'd say at least 6 months, because you're not going to be getting in enough business to start with. It's going to be a bit of a slog if you consider that you're going to have to spend a bit of time, even if you're not doing any kind of structural work. It took me about 3 months to get everything set up in this space, particularly if you're working another job as I was doing live sound work. You're not going to have that much time to do all the work you need to do to kit a space out, and it's going to take time to get some clients through the door and build a client base, unless you're already well established. That might not be the case for you, but I think for many of us it will be. So have some float money for rent. And my last point that I'll make is that I think you should really, if you're starting out, think about starting small to begin with and then grow and expand from there. I think that's often the best path for any kind of business, but particularly right now, the recording market with the influx of home recording. In the past, I talked about this in my last video, but in the past, musicians starting out and they want to do their first recordings, they didn't have the option of recording themselves. That just wasn't a thing, or at least was very expensive and inaccessible. And so really their only option was to go to a local recording studio. So if you built it, they would come. Whereas that's not so much the case now. And it takes longer before people get to a level, either because, they realize that they can record themselves at home, but actually the time and effort that it requires to get really good at that, they'd rather just spend that time making music and investing their energy in creating music, and they want someone else to handle the recording side of things. Or they get to a more professional level where they want to go into real high-end studios and work with things on a bigger budget level. So you've either got to be at that kind of high-end level, or you've just got to be very good out the bat and have a good USP where people, when they realize that actually they don't want to record themselves and they'd rather go to a studio, they're going to pick you. You will have fewer and fewer clients, especially starting out, and you're not going to have that client base of people that, are just looking to do their first recording at a local studio. It's more going to be trying to attract like serious musicians who understand the benefit of recording an actual studio. So start small. That's what I did with this space. I found somewhere with a low rental overhead. Commercial property prices in the UK right now, you're not going to get a lot of square footage for your money. When you compare it to residential rental prices, you're probably looking at about, a quarter of the square footage in a commercial property, in line with the rental cost, if that makes sense. So to compare, my studio is £350 a month for roughly 500 square foot. I don't know what the square footage is on my house that I rent, but my house is about double that per month in rent. And I would say, I've maybe got like 4 times the amount of square footage. So you're getting at least double the amount of square footage on residential rental properties. If you can start small and make a small space work for you, then you're going to be able to keep your rental costs low. And then that's going to take off some of the financial burden. And especially initially as you're starting up, it's going to relieve some pressure in terms of seeing some return and actually making a profit on your business. So I would think about that. I would think about looking at somewhere. When I found this property, when I first went to view it, I saw it and I knew it would be perfect for my needs because it already had rooms built out within it. And actually they're all brick walls, no plasterboard, fairly well insulated and isolated. It's still not great. You can hear noise as well from above sometimes. So I'm in my own individual unit, but it's part of a larger building where there are other office businesses, and that's another thing where I knew going in I wouldn't be able to record drums and loud stuff like 9 to 5 throughout the week, so I only do that in the evenings, weekdays, and then recording on weekends. But that kind of works for me because a lot of the people that I'm working with, they're all working 9 to 5 anyway, so they're not going to be looking to record at those times, and then I can just do mixing and other admin throughout the week, 9 to 5. And a lot of my time spent working is doing live sound anyway, so I only have a limited amount of time to do stuff at the studio as it is. But essentially, layout-wise, it meant that I could just move in, and I only needed to kit the rooms out, but I didn't need to do any structural work, which saved me a huge amount of money. If you can find somewhere like that, that is the ideal, really. It will mean that there might be compromises. I was kind of stuck with the size of the rooms and the layout of the rooms as they were. But, you work with what you've got and you make it work for you. And I think, if you can save on that kind of startup cost, that's really going to help you in the long run and help you grow your business. In terms of finding properties, I would look on your property websites like Zoopla and Rightmove, places like that. That is where you're going to find the bulk of your rental listings online. But I would also look on estate agents' websites directly, because sometimes you'll see stuff there that doesn't get advertised on these larger sites, or they're advertised initially on the estate agent sites before they get listed elsewhere, and sometimes they'll get snapped up in that time, so they won't even end up on these bigger sites like Zoopla and Rightmove. It's also worth checking Gumtree in the UK and Facebook Marketplace, because you will find a lot of spaces that when they're not being let out by letting agents and it's the landlord directly letting them, quite often they list on those spaces. I've seen quite a few places on Facebook Marketplace, especially your more kind of unusual industrial type lettings that might work for a recording studio space. I've seen a lot of those pop up on Facebook Marketplace, often at cheaper rental costs as well, because you're dealing directly with the landlord and they've not got the associated fees that they have to pay for a letting agent to let and manage the property. So those can be good options. I would also just have a drive around or walk around your local area, especially if you know that there are any industrial pockets or particular areas where, there are a lot of business, commercial type properties. I would have a look around those places, because again, sometimes you'll see places up for let and they've not been listed online yet, but sometimes they get snapped up before they even hit the internet. Sometimes things aren't even advertised on the internet at all. It's pretty rare, I think, these days, but it's worth just looking around your local area. Also, actually seeing stuff in person, even though you won't be able to look inside the buildings until you've got a viewing, you can at least get a feel of the local area. It is important to kind of scope that out. Is it an area where it feels safe, particularly with people, if people are coming and going late at night? Does it feel safe? Is it an area where there are going to be noise disturbances? All those kind of things, very important to consider. So going and actually viewing areas in person can be really beneficial as opposed to just looking online. So I hope that's been useful to you. Give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Comment down below with your thoughts if you've struggled with trying to find a space for a recording studio, or just let us know what your journey has been like. I'd love to hear about that in the comments. So shout out down below and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this. It really helps me out. And I'll see you guys again in the next one.